as you'll see as we go. And I'm not quite sure how to, I was going to have a clicker. Thanks, Andrew. So, obviously that photograph was taken in New Guinea, and I'm pretty sure that must be Charles Hornabrook standing there next to Dad. These were some of the resources that I acquired along the way looking into this topic, and the one on the left there is Carlton Gagesek's extract from his correspondence and journals to establish who did what when in relation to Kuru, which was quite important, as you'll hear more about. And Judith Farquhar was his data management technician in his NIH laboratory. The next is Annette, I'm just wondering if this has got a lazy, yes it does, that's Annette Beasley. I haven't got much of a trim, but it's not too bad. She is a local anthropologist, and she's written quite a lot in this area, and including one on the wrangling that took place during this research program in New Guinea, which was pretty extreme. And her writing's interesting, and she sat down with Dick and got him to talk about his life in New Guinea, which he was quite reluctant to do. And the plan was that they would go back over it and clarify things that she didn't quite get, and see what else it stimulated. And that never happened because Dick at that stage was losing his memory and lost it completely before the project got to that point. So actually the book concerns an awful lot about phase experiences in New Guinea and not so much about Dick's. I think Annette was quite interested in that aspect too, though, so she was happy. Vincent Zegas we're going to hear more about. This is one of his two unreliable biographies. And inside the flyleaf of this book, I found these two things: the funeral notice from Queensland, some sort of obituary, a picture of him and his wife. And I bought this book online from that large second-hand book company, which I can't remember the name of. And it came from a Dutch warehouse, second-hand book warehouse. And it turns out Yeti was Dutch, and that was Vin Zegas' wife. And inside the flyleaf of the book, I found this and a 4-page obituary, or eulogy really, for Vin Zegas, written by Carlton Gagesek. And I know that Yeti went back to Holland after Vin had died, and I'm suspicious this book may in fact have been her property. And furthermore, this book here has H. Nelson on the inside of the flyleaf. Turns out H. Nelson is a prominent, probably a Hank Nelson is a prominent PNG historian. So all kinds of stuff turns up when you start doing this historical business. Where am I? I'm figuring what to do. So when I first got interested in neurology, not long after I started in clinical medicine, it was widely rumoured that Dick had been pushed aside somehow by Carlton Gagesek, who'd grabbed the Nobel Prize for himself. As you can imagine, the story wasn't quite true. Nevertheless, Dick was quite closely involved in the story of the unravelling of the mystery of Kuru. And not long after that, Carlton Gagesek came to Wellington and gave a talk, and I remember he mesmerised the theatre, and he had 2 slide projectors going, and everything was whizzy-bangy, and it was all going to happen because it had just been discovered that people with Down syndrome were much more sensitive to developing Alzheimer's disease than the rest of the population. He thought this was going to be the clue to unravelling the cause of Alzheimer's. Nothing much seems to have come of that in the end. Although, you know, he was a smart guy and things happen. Anyway, we went to Dick's house for dinner afterwards, and Carlton, but just before that, in other discussions with Dick prior to that time, he had mentioned to me that he thought Carlton had deserved his success, and he really ascribed it to knowing the literature, but there was even more to it than that, as you'll see as we go along. So in discussion at the dinner, Carlton told me that he could speak about 60 languages. Now, he is known for exaggeration, so I divided that by 10, and it's still quite a few. And he came from Central Europe, somewhere near where Vin Zigas was from, who we'll get to. And they both probably could speak the same language group, I think. Though Carlton's dad was Hungarian and his mother was from Slovakia, I think, just across the border. He claimed to me that he could arrive at a village and without knowing the language at all, and there were about 4 language groups in the area they were working in, and that he could sit down with one of the old ladies in the village and talk to her and point to things, and within about 20 minutes he could be having some form of communication with her. But when I actually read his remarks in his journal as he studies Kuru, it's clear that it took him about 3 months to get to grips with 4A, which is about the same time it would take even a non-linguist, I think, to start making progress. So. And he was doing it all day, every day, trying to interview patients. And the interviews took 2 to 3 hours, trying to go back through their genealogies and figure out who in the family might have had Kuru. One of their prime motivations for this was the belief it might be a genetic disease. And he joked too at the time that they were very keen to get the autopsies fresh, and he kind of implied that he wasn't always completely sure the patient had died. They were very ill, these people, one would have to say, and they were on the mud floor of a grass hut, and deciding whether they died or not might have been, in fact, really quite tricky. There was one case like that described by Vin Zigas where he realised the patient was alive, stopped the procedure. But anyway, I think this was happening. I don't think these people were ghouls. This was happening in an extraordinary environment. Sometime later, Dick and I saw we had a patient admitted for investigation who had a neuropathy and a big spleen, and we thought he might have Gaucher's disease, and for some reason, this was long before the days of metabolic physicians or even decent lab tests, and it was never really established. But Dick mentioned that, I think I might have said something that I wasn't too confident deciding whether someone had a big spleen or not, and he said, when I was working in New Guinea, everyone had big spleens, and I got really used to it. So he obviously did get a lot of expertise in practical and tropical medicine. He did tell me too that he was unwilling to write a memoir about his time in New Guinea because everyone was aware of Carlton Gajdussek's improper fascination with adolescent boys, and nobody really felt they could do anything about it. And I think in Dick's defence, the Australian patrol officers who were out to get Gajdusek knew this too, and they didn't do anything about it. You know, they were the law and order, so I don't think Dick needs to feel that he had to do anything special. As people may know, he was eventually prosecuted in the US for child sexual abuse and convicted and spent 4 years in jail, and was then a sort of a refugee in Europe, or refugee is perhaps the wrong word. Can't think of the correct word. This was Dick's other interest, as most people know, and he started doing it when he was about 7, and while he was in New Guinea, this was one of, this was one of his other achievements, this book here. So Dick was born in Wellington. He came from a wealthy background and was privately educated, and from 7 he was an avid collector of beetles and butterflies, and the family spent World War II in Sydney, and Dick went to secondary school at Knox College, which is a big private school in Sydney, famous one. And he had a good relationship with the headmaster, told the headmaster he wanted to be an entomologist. The headmaster suggested medicine with a bit of entomology on the side might be the way to go, which turned out to be a good recipe. And in March 1946, the family came back to New Zealand and Dick started in second year med. His final year dissertation was extraordinary, and it was on the effect of catapotoxin on laboratory animals. And I think there was a stronger vibe of individual investigation, I think, was expected of medical students then, certainly than it is now. And Anyway, after this, Dick came to Wellington and did his 2 years as house surgeon here, and he really wanted to be, at that time he really wanted to be a neurosurgeon. So he went back to Dunedin to do the anatomy demonstration 1 year course, which I think still runs now probably, but it certainly was running when we were at medical school for people who wanted to be surgeons and that kind of, most of the time, just not specifically neurosurgeons. And a couple of years before, Jock Cowie, who was a Queen Square educated neurologist, had been taken on the staff and had introduced clinical neurology into the medical school program and also into the practice in the hospital, I guess. They would have had medical people interested in neurology, but no one who was actually a neurologist. And Dick joined his ward rounds, and pretty obviously this was probably putting together the surgical training with the medical side of neurology with a view to practicing as a neurosurgeon. But he got more and more interested in it. And Cowie encouraged him to do an MD degree, which he did on the study of rats exposed to cold, and then under various and then they were had various kinds of endocrine deprivation done surgically, removing thyroids, pituitary glands, things like that, and reassessing their ability to stand cold. I think he said it was boring and difficult, as many higher degrees are. And at that time, he also met Ian MacDonald, who went on to become a very famous neurologist, and many people will know of him. He was a MS expert. He must have been about 5 or 6 years younger than Dick. And the Otago school was then a bit of a neuroscience powerhouse. John Eccles, who was an Australian, was the professor of physiology, and he got a Nobel Prize shortly after this in 1963 for his work on synapses. And Archie McIntyre was an equally famous and perhaps even more gifted neurophysiologist. It was Archie McIntyre who brought in the microelectrodes that John Eccles used to do his synapse work. Archie went on to Australia to continue his career, I think, at Monash. And then there was a series of lucky and fortuitous encounters. In 1953, Sir Charles Symons, who was a famous British neurologist, came on a speaking tour at the end of his career. He retired from Queen Square a few years later. And Dick, who was obviously neurologically interested and also interested in natural history and trout fishing, was asked to take Charles Symons on a tour of Central Otago, Lake Mackenzie, I think. Not sure that is in Central Otago, but you get the general idea. On the tour, Charles Symons persuaded Dick that a career in neurosurgery would be boring beyond endurance. I'm not really sure if that's true either. Anyway, we'll take it that it is. Dick had the necessary requisites to get a job on the house in Queen Square. He had a higher degree and training in neurology. And he was there first as a clinical observer for 18 months and then as a house physician for 3 years. And during that time he would have worked with Gordon Holmes, who was famous for cerebellar, expert on cerebellar disease. Now that's relevant because cerebellar disease was the main feature of these patients we're about to encounter. But it was a bit strange, and I think it remains strange. I think Dick found it strange. Macfarlane Burnet, who went on to get a Nobel Prize himself for acquired immunity, I think it was to do with skin graft reception and immunosuppression associated with that, who was a very famous and deservedly so Australian scientist, virologist, influenza expert. I think he might have produced the first influenza vaccine. Went to speak at Queen Square. I'm not quite sure what about, but anyway, Dick sat with him at dinner and he heard all about Kuru, and he also heard all about Gadjusek, who Macfarlane Burnet regarded as the greatest medical pirate of all time, where he just committed the greatest act of medical piracy of all time. Which was basically to get on with the job of investigating Kuru while the Australians made up their mind whether they needed insurance to go to New Guinea and protection from the natives, etc., which they'd been worrying about for about 5 years I think it took Carlton that wasn't bothered by those kinds of problems. Anyway, very shortly after this, 2 papers on Kuru by Gajasek and Vigas appeared, one in the Medical Journal of Australia a week late and one in the New England Journal a week early. And more on that to follow. These were the two papers, and there was also a leading article which said this work could have been done equally well in Australia, but we shouldn't be miffed because it's bad matters. But they were extremely miffed, and this was the paper, Kuru, Clinical Study of a New Syndrome Resembling Paralysis Agitans in the natives of the Eastern Highlands of Australia and New Guinea. The paper's great, but the conclusion's not so great because most of the paper is about how they had all these cerebellar signs, and then a few late in the piece they got reduced facial movement and tremor that might have been Parkinsonian. So really, it wasn't a fair description of their own work. But I suppose that's beside the point. Just prior to this happening, Gajasek had given an assurance to the administrator of the New Guinea territory that his Australian co-worker would be given due credit. Well, in fact, he was supposed to be first author, but also be given due credit. So you can see that the American paper has Gajasek in front and appeared a week early, and the Australian paper has Vigas in the front, somewhere down here, and appeared the following week, all carefully orchestrated. And then there was a third fortuitous event, and so in July 1959, Dick left Queen Square, and he had a friend who worked at Bellevue Hospital, which is a notorious hospital, great place to work, but it's a 4,000 bed hospital, 3,000 of them internal medicine, I think, and 1,000 of them psychiatric, and it served a large deprived population of the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and the main difference between that and a New Zealand hospital is the disproportionate number of syndromes associated with violence, trauma, alcohol and drug and substance abuse. Wernicke's encephalopathy, the monograph on that by Maurice Victor, was written by patients they'd seen at Bellevue. In 1961, having run a bit foul of the American immigration laws, Dick and Faye came to New Zealand to work as Dick had a job as half-time clinical neurologist at Wellington Hospital, responsible also for Poruru and Masterton, and he did private practice in the rest of his time. He found it hard to settle. He felt, I think, that the physicians had made it clear to him that they thought they could do the neurology and would do it. And he was finding it hard to get patients admitted into hospital for the investigations that he wanted to do. And all this was still going on when I was a medical registrar, neurology registrar. And it was getting more and more difficult to bring people in and keep them there for a week or even a few days to do tests on them, which was often necessary. Some of the patients came from all over the southern North Island, so you couldn't just bring them to an outpatient clinic, and it took ages to get anything done. So in 1962, he applied for a grant to do an epidemiology course at the Atlanta CDC, and he got that grant from the Canadian Multiple Sclerosis Society. And on his return, he did some preliminary research and presented his findings at a meeting in Tokyo in 1963. And by chance, Gajasek was at his presentation, and he knew that the P&G Medical Research Advisory Committee, which was set up entirely to frustrate Gajasek, was looking for a British trained neurologist to lead research into Kuru and also to keep Gajasek under control. Gajasek must have had a sneaky feeling he might be able to elude Dick, I think, which he certainly did do. And he alerted the committee to the fact that Dick might be available. And on his return from Tokyo, Dick got a letter offering him a job for the next 2 years as the lead clinical investigator of Kuru in Papua New Guinea. which he took like a shot. And this is where the places are, and if you're like me, you won't have any idea of the geography of Papua New Guinea. For one thing, it wasn't actually a country, it was a Australian area of influence, really. This part, Papua, was in fact an Australian colony. This part, this is just after World War II, New Guinea was in fact a UN protectorate, and Australia was administering it on behalf of the UN, and they wanted to do better than other previous colonial powers, so they were sort of on their best behaviour in managing the situation in New Guinea, and did quite a good job, I think. The key places are Goroka, where there's an airport. Whoops, apologies. Kainantu, which is the nearest decent-sized town, probably about 3 houses, and then this patrol post Okapa, which is in the middle of the Kuru area, which is this area here. And it all looks pretty fine on a map like that, but when you see the actual terrain, which I thought I was going to show a photo of, it's going to come sometime. Let's carry on with this. Anyway, changing the subject for a moment from the terrain and difficulties associated with it, which will become clear in a minute. So Dick had this job for 2 years as the chief clinical investigator, and at 3 years later, he got the offer of another job as the director of the new Institute of Human Biology, charged with recruiting staff and implementing research into human adaptability, which was basically a trough of money provided by the European community with a slightly woolly program of investigating people's adaptation to the environment, particularly people who had gone from the primitive world to the modern world within a generation, were of some interest to them. But as you can imagine, it's a bit vague, and it was hard to get to grips with, and it was hard to get investigators, and then it was hard to get meaningful answers to research questions and set under that framework, which Dick found quite frustrating. They chose 2 sites. One was on the coast and one was at Lufa, which is not very far from that area, that Kuru area that I showed you just before. And in 1973, when independence came, the name was changed to the Papua New Guinea Institute of Medical Research, and the Australian domiciled academics, there were 4 of them on the board had to resign. And really the situation became a bit difficult because the people on the board were really politicians who were the new Papua New Guineans or indigenous people on the board, and they really didn't have the time, energy or enthusiasm for the Institute, and they really felt the Institute should be devoted entirely to projects to directly benefit New Guineans now, which to be fair was part of this, which I didn't mention, was Dick put a sort of advertisement in the American Journal of Science, which is pretty prestigious, and split the program between these ideas and projects of immediate benefit to local New Guineans. So he stuck this out for about 3 years, but he was there for the last 2 on his own because Faye and the kids had to come back to school so Charles could start secondary school. So his enthusiasm started to wind down then. Ultimately, as an academic, he was pretty successful. He had 68 publications in PubMed, which is not bad going from this sort of background. And I mentioned that I'd say something about the environment. This was the road, 40-mile road between Kainantu, where the airstrip was, I think it was a Cessna-type airstrip, to Okapa, where the Australian patrol post was, and there was a small hospital there. And that was in the middle of the Kuru area. And this is what you might have to do to get your Land Rover between place A and place B. No, I left out the photo with the bridge collapse, which was on the flat and not as exciting, not as impressive, but probably equally disruptive. And when you're out on patrol, I don't think it was all like this, but it really was. It is called the Eastern Highlands, and it's not for no reason, you know. And the biggest mountain is 12,000 feet, or nearly 13,000 feet. Mount Michael's not very far from here. And so here are some of the indigenous helpers lugging chests of instruments and gear over, just about impossible terrain. It almost looks like climbing material, doesn't it? And there's a river, one called the Lamari in particular, which is fairly fearsome, but the rivers were often high and quite dangerous to cross, and the bridges weren't a heck of a lot better. Not always in good repair. And this also gives you some idea of both of the problems they were facing and the conditions that they were working under. So this is Carlton Gajasek, who had a tendency to be fat, but he's not looking fat at all here. And Vin Zegas, Carlton's tapping the knee jerks, Vin's making notes. And this is a kid who has early Kuru, and he's in the middle of having a myoclonic jerk. His arms are going like this, and they caught him on the photograph. And here, obviously, he's doing a finger-nose-finger test, and notice that someone's holding him up, so he's got truncal ataxia, basically, pretty severe, probably. I'm not sure if it's the same kid, but it looks like it is. But he's standing okay here, as you can see his feet are quite a long way apart. So. And I suppose the background gives you some idea of the conditions that people were living in, and what would happen is that the people would become more and more immobile, and eventually they'd have to move into their huts, which were often grass sort of wigwam things, short, only about this high. And it wasn't uncommon for them to get burns from the fire inside the hut, and they were in pretty bad state by this time, unable to stand, unable to sit, often unable to feed themselves, and then they would get bed sores or pressure sores, and then they would get septicemia and die. But it was pretty clear that they were not going anywhere, positive at that time. And this would play out over about somewhere between 3 months and 12 months, usually around about 6 months, from first symptom to death. So Kuru was first reported for certain by an Australian patrol officer called Arthur Carey. This foray area wasn't even known about until around about this time, and then it was required to be, as they put it, controlled, which meant you could go there without getting murdered by the locals or something else happening to you. And so he described the symptoms of the disease and called for investigation and some sort of effective treatment. And in fact, the Australian government inadvertently provided that treatment not very long after that, and we'll come to that in a second. The foray pattern of early marriage for girls was probably influenced by the fact that this disease, Kuru, was killing about 1% of people per year, and almost all of them were women. Well, actually, that's not quite true, but a very large proportion of them were women. And in 1957, which is about the time that this all happens, Charles Julius, who was a government anthropologist, did a survey of South Foray sorcery beliefs. The South Foray were the last group to sort of admit patrol officers and become controlled, as they say. I don't think this control was actually that difficult. The general impression was that people were quite keen to stop fighting and killing each other over Kuru sorcery, which is what a lot of this was about. And this was pretty peaceful, this process. And in most areas, the women and the uninitiated boys had both the right and the duty to eat their dead relatives, and they ate just about everything that was edible as part of the funeral rites. And I think these rites probably applied more broadly in New Guinea, but the Foray were the last people who were actually practicing them because they'd been cut off so long from other influences. Charles Julius described other forms of sorcery, but particularly the Foray obsession with Kuru, perhaps not surprising at all. And what the sorcery consisted of was that the sorcerer, who was often imaginary, would obtain a part of the person's body, like a fingernail or something, or some fecal material, and he would wrap it up in leaves and leave it to sink in a swamp. And the idea was that once it had decayed, the victim would die. And sometimes the the doctors and the government patrollers would try to get them to practice the sorcery on them and show that they didn't actually die, but this wasn't convincing. This belief was, very firmly held. And if the sorcerer was identified, they were subjected to a particularly gruesome ritual murder, which must have been, it was more than just being killed. It was sort of being horribly tortured and then killed, a la Henry VIII or something. And this produced ongoing violence inside and between villages. The villages could have 80 to 300 people odd inside them. They tend to be in stockades on ridges. The stockades weren't very large, but they were up on a ridge, so they couldn't be attacked easily. So in parallel, the Australian administration were doing their bit for the foray, and they took measures to stop violence inside and between groups, which basically involved nominating headmen in the village and holding them somewhat accountable for the actions of other people in the village, and then bringing a roving judge through to deal with murders and things like that at periodic intervals and with a proper legal process. They banned cannibalism in the late 1950s. It struggled on a little bit for a few years, but it probably stopped about 1960. And that's important because it turns out that no person born after 1960 ever contracted Kuru. So that's what I meant about the Australian government. This is a classic case where, pretty crude public health measures actually controlled the epidemic before it was even understood. Just by good luck, really. And they conducted annual village censuses, which were very useful in figuring out how many people were dying per year, how many people were affected, what the infection rate was, all this sort of stuff. And it gradually became clear that there were no cases born after 1960, but people went on dying for quite a long time after that. And it turned out that even though children could come down with it, the incubation period was really quite variable and could be quite long. The longest case, who presumably had a 50-year incubation period, died in 2009. There haven't been any deaths from Kuru since then. So there were many players in this saga. I mentioned Vincent Zegas. He was the district medical officer who first brought this forcibly to the attention of his medical director and the Australian public. I don't think he did the public part of it, but that's how people got wind of it. And actually that isn't true. He took a couple of patients to Port Moresby and showed them a medical meeting, and that caused an absolute furore about these people with cannibals with laughing death, I think it was, and made the international press. So he did actually get things moving. Apologies. Carbon Gadjasek, more about in a minute. Shirley Gass, who, with her husband Robert, were field anthropologists for a competing research team from Adelaide, who were geneticists, more of whom they didn't make the list actually, and more of whom later, and Sir Macfarlane Burnet, who won the Nobel Prize about 3 years later, as I mentioned, and who was this famous scientist and is a key player, and Dick Hornabrook. So this is Vincent Zegas. He was a colourful character who'd been born in Estonia, went to medical school in Germany, actually went to a whole series of medical schools, about 5. I think this was the model where you could, and the British used to follow this model too. If you went to the University of London, you could carry out years of your degree in other reputable medical schools and then turn up for the final exam and pass. And he was obviously doing something like that. Apologies. He was at medical school during World War II in Hamburg, and during the holidays or vacation time, he had to serve on the Eastern Front, and for 2 years he was there after graduation. And the sort of work he had to do was, do the ward round on the cut off all the broken legs and so on that had come in over the previous day. So he had pretty, high level training in I guess, sort of extreme surgical problems. And he describes one case where one of the big men in the village got a spear through the chest, and he pushed it all the way through, cut off one end, and pulled it out, and no chest tube or intubation of one bronchus or anything like that. Sewed the guy up and he survived. He was interned in a transit camp, as many people were after World War II, and he was at high risk of being sent back to, in fact it was Lithuania, I think, which had become a Kaliningrad under the Russians, and he was at high risk of being shipped east and never seen again, which is what had happened to his father and his mother. He was recruited to Australia, and as part of that recruitment process he was allowed to serve as a ship's medical officer, but once he arrived in Australia he wasn't allowed to work as a medical doctor. And in fact very few people of this large group from the Baltic states ever succeeded in working as doctors. They mostly had to do menial work for the rest of their lives. You could go back and repeat the whole year of medical, a whole 3 or 4 years, I think it was 3 years of medical school, but then there was no guarantee that you would be granted a licence, much in the same way if you're a GP and go to work in Australia, you're not necessarily going to get a provider number. It was the same deal, only even more extreme. And anyway, what he was able to do was go to work in Papua New Guinea, and so he was recruited there and went there in 1950. And he spoke a lot of languages relevant to the places where he had lived and worked, or lived and studied. And he was relatively quick to learn Melanesian Pidgin, which was the lingua franca in the Foray and other tribal area. There were several other language groups, as I mentioned, around the Foray area, all served from the Opaka hospital medical base, which he was responsible for. And I think what gave him a bit of an edge was that he was very public health focused, and so he didn't just want to be a GP for the people with their individual rashes and yaws and so on. He wanted to make interventions that would be broadly applicable to the health system and make a difference across the board to large numbers of people. And he managed to achieve this by training people as nurses and as medical assistants, and then sending them out to carry out the tasks that otherwise he would have had to do. And this wasn't because he was lazy, this was his policy. As a result, he was pretty widely respected, and he sort of had his tentacles out through the whole area with people he'd trained who were working there, so that when they went to a village to meet the people with Kuru, who were often hidden from visiting doctors and often wanted to hide anyway themselves because they couldn't really accept yet that they had Kuru. He had, a way with him that allowed him access to these people and to start the process of investigation moving. And he'd already sent 26 serological samples from individual patients and one brain to this chap, Gray Anderson, who worked in McFarlane Burnett's lab and was probably doing a postdoc, I think. And this was the beginning of trouble. Anyway, sorry about this, keep pressing the wrong button. No viral transmission was demonstrated on the membranes of eggs or on mice. And so they thought this really had to be a viral illness, but this was a pretty big obstacle. And it seemed to them that this therefore raised the probability that Kuru might in fact be a genetic disease. And ZS's role was to raise this vigorously with John Gunter, who was the Director of Public Health in New Guinea. There's more information that I really need on this slide, but it was really just to establish that John Gunter was a pretty dedicated and experienced public health physician in the islands. He'd gone there as a medical officer, but he'd done lots of public health work, so he was a good choice for the Director of Public Health. But a year later, or just a few months later, he became the assistant administrator to Cleland. So this is the administrative structure for the Papua New Guinea territory. So Cleland's the man in charge, and most of the work is done by the assistant administrator, who was this chap John Gunter. So he was quite helpful to Zegas and Gajusek, but Burnett got onto him and pointed out that Gajusek was a medical pirate from America and this should really be being done by Australians, and he was somewhat influenced by this. But Burnett wanted Gajusek kicked out of the New Guinea territory, but he wasn't able to do that because it was a UN mandate, and Gajusek knew this. And he also had to deal with Bennett's Adelaide genetic investigators group, who decided that they'd proven that the problem was genetic, and they came up with an impractical proposal to isolate the whole 4A people, including ones that had migrated outside the tribal area for work, which there were quite a few of. And being a typical bureaucrat, John Gunter, and perhaps a bit suspicious, he got their work and conclusions independently assessed, and it was found that actually their data was inconsistent with their model, but it certainly was a complicated matter. You know. But it was a convenient outcome for him. This is McFarlane Burnett, who I've told you most of the things about. I probably don't really need this slide. And then there was Dick. And I mentioned this committee meeting that was convened in Adelaide to basically to get rid of Gajusek and to advise the Director of Public Health on medical research in the territories. And the recommendation of the meeting was that a clinical investigator be appointed to be in charge of all Kuru research, including the activities of visitors in the Okapa area, and that he be responsible for all field research. So as a result of this, Dick was offered the job and then appointed as the Chief Clinical Investigator of Kuru and Head of the Institute of Human Biology for a 2-year term. And it was privately made clear to him that his job was to protect Australian interests and control, in particular that meant controlling Gajusek. Gajusek is the medical pirate mentioned. He had an undergraduate degree in physical chemistry, so he was, a fairly smart character. He's board-certified paediatrician from trained in the Mass General. He was a research virologist and an epidemiologist with a chap called Joe Smartle at the NIH. Joe Smartle was he was a close associate of one of the people that set up the CDC for monitoring outbreaks after World War II, and Gajusek had a habit of going and training with people who were pretty effective in their jobs and had been very successful. He was a good choice he was good at choosing supervisors, and he was highly productive and self-motivated, and he'd done sole investigator studies of hemorrhagic fever outbreaks in South America, Iran and Central Asia. And I think it was helped a lot by his ability to manage languages. It was very useful to him in doing this kind of work. But I think he may have had another drive. Now, I know this got way too much information, but it's really kind of interesting, this particular stuff, because this is an informal letter from Frank McFarlane Burnett to John Gunter telling him what he really thought about Gajusek, and it makes quite good reading. And it's quite well written, and it's quite perceptive. So he's an extraordinary individual of American birth, brought up as a child in Central Europe and multilingual. There's no question about his intelligence or training, and I found myself very interested in his enthusiasm for the paediatric and cultural study of the development of children in primitive communities. There's a bit of a red flag over that, really, isn't there? On the other hand, his personality is quite extraordinary. He's almost legendary among my colleagues in the US. John Enders, who has incidentally had a Nobel Prize for creating the conditions for generating for the polio vaccine, told me that Gajusek was very bright, but you never knew when he would leave off work for a week to study Hegel or a month to go off and work with the Hopi Indians. And in fact, his arrival in New Guinea was very much along these lines. He went there to meet up with someone and then stayed to investigate Kuru. Smartle in Washington said the only way to handle him was to kick him in the tail. I'm sure he put it a different way. And someone else told me he was fine, but there just wasn't anything human about him. He says, actually I got on better than I expected with Gajdusek in his 15 months at the Institute. During the last 4 or 5 months he did some first-rate work on the autoimmune reaction, and we parted on excellent terms. I think this was a complement-mediated detection of autoantibodies in hepatitis and some other autoimmune conditions. My own summing up was that he had an intelligent quotient up in the 180s and in the emotional immaturity of a 15-year-old. He's quite manically energetic when his enthusiasm is roused, and he can inspire enthusiasm in his technical assistants. This will prove to be true. He is completely self-centered, thick-skinned and inconsiderate, but equally won't let danger, physical difficulty or other people's feelings interfere with it in the least with what he wants to do. He apparently has no interest in women, but an almost obsessional interest in children, none whatever in his clothes and cleanliness, and he can live something or other without any difficulty in a slum or a grass hut. He's not a first-class scientist in any field, but I doubt whether anyone in the world has anything like his knowledge of children in primitive communities in very many parts of the world. So that seemed pretty perceptive, I think. So this is the dispute that arose. Gajdusek had already spent 1955 in PNG studying the growth and development of children in primitive cultures in another location. In April '56, Burnett wrote to the Ministry of Territories proposing a research programs in PNG. I'm sorry about the typo. Burnett first heard of Kuru in 1955, and it's interesting that his son Ian was a patrol officer, so that's probably where he got his information from. Although I guess not necessarily, because he obviously had a finger in a lot of medical pies, and he was a clever guy. It was actually Ian that Gajdusek was supposedly visiting when he went off piste and started investigating Kuru along the way. In July '56, Burnett went to PNG and met Zigas and arranged for Gray to Anderson from the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute in Melbourne. It's a big medical research institute, to work with him. So that was sort of background to those specimens being sent off to Melbourne to get processed. And in March '57, Gajdusek arrived, and having just completed his fellowship with Burnett at the Hall Institute, he was supposed to be on his way back to the National Institutes of Health, but he was scouting out places to carry on his child development studies when Zigas showed him the patients with Kuru. So I think some of this is redundant. In fact, I think it's almost all redundant, except for this, but he probably had heard something about Kuru at the Institute. There had been a bit of talk about it. And en route to Lua in the Western Highlands, or just slightly to the west of Opaka, he met Vin Zigas, who introduced him to the patients with Kuru. And Gajdusek realised at once this was a serious epidemic of something new, no one had ever seen before, which turned out to be right, of course. And so, sorry about the redundancy up here, but so Gajdusek's manic enthusiasm and tireless physical and intellectual energy infected Zigas, who was a bit similar, and they began patrols throughout the district to establish the extent of the disease and the numbers of cases. They began in March in '57, and their papers came out on about 150 patients in November, so they really got on with it, and they turned the patients inside out, all kinds of investigations done in the bush that you probably can't do in Wellington, and most of them done manually, in woven huts, and things like panty curves on the cerebrospinal fluid and stuff like that. When Burnett got wind of this, he wrote to Gajdusek telling him his behaviour was unethical and tried to get Gunter to kick him out of PNG, which he wasn't able to do. he refused to leave, saying he had too many sick patients, and listing what was wrong with the ones that were in hospital. There was an influenza outbreak, I think, and the Kuru problem was also too important to abandon. And privately, he told Zigas the territory was a UN mandate, and he could do what he liked there. So he knew nothing much could happen, and didn't really care what it did, which was basically to set up this bureaucratic machinery of the Research Council. I don't have Gajusek's take on this, but Cleland, he was the boss of the territory, reported back to the Department of Territories that Gajusek had agreed that in any publications he would put Zigas, our own preliminary investigator, and the original finder of the condition, in the position of senior author. It's a bit vague which position is the senior author, whether she go at the front or the back. I always thought the senior author went at the back of the paper, so Gajusek was definitely playing around with them over this. And anyway, Burnett, meantime, set up a medical research committee with himself as the chair, with the right to approve and control Kuru research programs. But of course, he was in Melbourne, and there wasn't a heck of a lot he could do about it. These were the two articles. And as I mentioned, Gajusek's first author on the New England Journal article, and Vigas's first author on the Australian article, which is here somewhere. Yeah. No, this is very important, but it's kind of funny. And then along comes Henry Bennett, who history won't treat kindly. He was Professor of Human Genetics at Adelaide. He got a rival team together who arrived in 1958. He was interested in much the same epidemiological information. They needed the family histories, really, and the names and dates and all that sort of stuff. The foray didn't have a very good way of determining time, but it could often be worked out by how old they were when the event occurred. And so if you were a clever historian, you could usually make pretty good sense of their interviews with them. Because after all, they're normal human beings with normal intellect, so they could be, just had to think of a way that meant something to them, and then you would get reliable information. And it was him who got, the one good thing Henry Bennett did do was he got Shirley and Robert Gass, who were Australian-trained anthropologists. Actually, Robert Gass was an American, but Shirley was an Australian-trained one with some connections in the scientific world. And this team proposed a theory of genetic transmission of Kuru, and they strongly and unrealistically advocated for this isolation of the foray to prevent transmission, and their genetic theory was discredited in 1963. And then this story is courtesy of Lindsay Hart. It's a rather typical Lindsay story, but I think it's true. Gajusek was climbing Ayers Rock, and he met a young woman he'd never seen before wearing a t-shirt with the slogan, "Gajusek's an arsehole." Apparently a run of these t-shirts had been printed off by an Australian research group, and this young woman was a member of the group. Given that Ayers Rock is in South Australia, I strongly suspect it was Bennett's group. Now, Gunter suggested that the parties just get on with their own work, and he didn't want to hear about it. And in March, there was a discussion at the NIH between Bennett, Gajusek and his superiors, and it was worked out that some method of working that would avoid duplication of work or clash of interest, whatever this was. I didn't really look into this in too much detail. In August, Gajusek turned up, that was in March. In August, he turned up back in the foray region, but he wanted an open brief to range freely throughout the whole area to indulge in what he described as medical snooping. He didn't mean snooping on other people's business, he meant looking around to see what other illnesses might be about and what was going on. And Bennett and Robson took this very badly, said it was far beyond those previously stated and agreed objectives, incompatible with the continuance of our work, so that this was going to throw their toys out of the cot or whatever, which would have been a good thing. And they again tried to get them thrown out of PNG, showing they're slow learners. And anyway, they were pretty confident in their suggestive evidence for a genetical basis for Kuru. They criticised Gajusek, Hornabrook's lack of a major lead and failure to establish a sound hypothesis of Kuru causation. These turn out to be very poorly chosen words, which is about to come home to them all in a hurry. Where are we now? We're still in 59. It really wasn't until 66 that Gajdusek really sort of gazumped them all. Anyway, he argued the remote possibility of an infectious agent cannot yet be totally excluded, even though all of our data has pointed from the early beginnings, this is a poke at them really, to a genetic mechanism underlying Kuru pathogenesis. It was proposed in their first paper. And behind all this fighting was the fact, I think, that actually Zegas and Gajdusek were really the ones able to get the patients, because basically they had the long-term relationships and they cultivated the relationships, and they kept seeing those people again and again as they got sicker and sicker. And a few of them they persuaded to have autopsies, and a few of them to donate their brains to science. Then the big problem was that the Foray were terrified of sorcery. So if you got hold of their brain, you imagine what you could do to them, and well, I suppose you'd be dead, so I don't know quite how this all worked, but they must have been still afraid, that some sorcerer would follow them into the next life or whatever. And they also very strongly needed to go home to die, so they could be in Kainantu or somewhere in a hospital. If they looked like dying, their relatives would put them on their shoulders and cart them back over that 40-mile track and mud and clay to home so they could die at home. And it was also a bit difficult getting blood, urine and fecal samples, all of which were of some interest. This was made just for worm infections. And also the work was very time consuming and required a lot of skill, and Gajdusek reported it took him 2 to 3 hours to work through his structured approach to taking the genealogical history. And I'm not sure that these other guys actually just had the skills to do that. I think they obviously were getting something done, but I think with great difficulty, and probably getting very frustrated. And of course, for any investigation you do, although Gajdusek sneered at Dick a bit about this, you do need an accurate clinical diagnosis. I mean, Gajdusek was in fact pretty good as a doctor and as a neurologist, and they had. I've said here historical cases were common. They weren't really that common. There were a few historical cases, and there were a few people with tremors, and there were a few people with actual Parkinson's. Now, Shirley Gass, that I mentioned before, the anthropologist, she and her husband lived with the Foray, in the South Foray, for about a year in total, I think. And they worked out the difference between the kinship and the genealogical data. So the kinship is who you say your relatives are, and your genealogical data is who your mum and dad and brothers and sisters actually are. Because there were quite a few kids adopted out, and the arrangements were somewhat loose about who you actually lived with and seemed to be kin to. And they got to grips with these cannibalism rites that were part of the funeral, and they claimed to have proposed this as the mechanism of transmission of Kuru in 1962, but their first actual publication was in 1967. So they probably did do this, but they never told anybody, or in any way you could look up. And then the next thing that happens is that a chap called WJ, I'm not sure what it stands for, Hadlow, was working at a British agricultural institute. He was actually an American veterinary scientist. And a friend of his went through one of the London railway stations, and on the platform there was a big display of something to do with, or perhaps it was actually a museum, but I'm not quite sure. I think it was in fact at a station. There was a big display of the histology of Scrapie and something to do with Kuru. It must have been something to do with Kuru, and the guy recognised the brain histology and thought Hadlow would be interested in it. He'd spent a year looking at Scrapie brain histology, and he did have a look, and it looked exactly the same. And not only that, the sheep, it's called Scrapie because they get staggers and scrape things and so on. So it was different from the other transmissible spongiform transmissible diseases, like Yakub disease, in the distribution of brain lesions. So Scrapie had the same distribution as Kuru, mainly in the cerebellum, and mainly in the dermis of the cerebellum. I'm not sure about that part of it for Scrapie. So he sent a letter to the Lancet pointing out this and and didn't think much more of it. Gajdusek must have read the letter, went to visit Hadlow in 1960. And then this was kind of the amazing part. In 1963, he got permission to inoculate chimpanzees, which was a real big deal even then, and also to look after them for the length of time this took. And it wasn't for 3 years that they got any indication that this was going anywhere. You know, and you can imagine getting the funding for this in an animal research house, because these are big animals that have to be looked after carefully. And in 1966, the first chimpanzee came down with Kuru. So, so Gajdusek considered that he'd established that there was a slow virus as the cause of Kuru. In fact, he was wrong, and he never really admitted it. But because then another guy called Prusner from his own laboratory actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. Back to Dick for a minute. So Dick's contribution to the story happened when he was the director of Kuru Research, and he and Gajdusek did quite a lot of this together, I think. They used to go out on patrol together. Dick would do his patients, I guess Gajdusek would do whatever he was doing. So he saw 214 patients over that period, and he saw them every 2 weeks. So he was doing a lot of work, actually. It's about 100 patients a week, isn't it? Well, I guess 100 divided. But I suppose the actual consultations might not have taken all that long, apart from the first one. Anyway, but just getting there would have been difficult. The patients all lived in the Central Highlands area. This was from Dick's paper. I should have just left that out, but it's because it's kind of obvious. There were about 35,000 of them, but only about 12,000 of them were the actual 4A group who had the Kuru. So the others were just other tribal groups surrounding that area, and where possibly saw them either in their home or near their home to reduce suspicion, and saw them every week or two. And the case histories were usually obtained with the aid of a pidgin English-speaking man of the same tribal group as the patients, but in some cases a European linguist speaking the appropriate language is available. I can't imagine who that might have been. I do know that Dick and I've read some of Gajdusek's patrol diaries, and he talks about Dick doing this and Dick doing that, so they're obviously together, working together quite harmoniously at that particular time. And so what would go wrong for the patient is that they would start off with unsteadiness walking and with misplacement of the feet. And this seemed a bit odd, but there was a lot of walking from place to place over this very steep terrain, so the person behind would see the person in front putting their feet down funny, and that was the first sign of trouble. And often the patient who had it wasn't at first aware of it. And then it progressed to some sort of tremulousness of the leg muscles, as if struggling to remain steady, sort of like this, and clenching the ground with the toes, and then the legs seemed hypotonic, and the feet flopped down when walking. And the indigenous word for this was screw, loose, which means screw loose, I think. And they talked about loose knees. So it's quite funny pidgin, I think. Then they could no longer sit, and then they could no longer sit and later stand unaided, and I've talked about it before. They had a fine tremor that appeared in their hands, which became intention and tripe. So it sort of sounds like they had two tremors, one that I've got hanging onto the laser pointer, which luckily is pretty low amplitude at the moment. And the audience is not intimidating enough. And which later became intention tripe, which is the classic approaching the target, this sort of thing. But it sounds like they had some kind of jerking. And Dick says it wasn't true myoclonus or athetosis, which is, twisting, writhing movements like this, or chorea, which is fidgety, twitchy sort of movements. But it must have really been this, I think. And it seemed to be provoked by limb use, and certainly limb use would make all these tremors worse, except maybe the athetosis of the career. Speech became slurred, swallowing affected. Eventually the person couldn't talk. There were no striking abnormality of the eye movements typical of cerebellar disease, but they did have oscillations on lateral gaze which weren't nystagmus. They might have been square wave jerks, which nobody was really aware of in those days, which are a little like this if you record from, which hence the square wave. Some of them had brisk reflexes, meaning they may have had motor cortex or spinal cord involvement. Sensation for vibration position sense was normal. That's important because you can get ataxia like this from sensory loss, you know, and it's pretty clear they didn't have that. He said the people could understand this test and you could tell they were doing it right. So, and many of them became suspicious and paranoid and some angrily aggressive, some violently attacked their neighbours or family, and referred to as Bilong Kuru, and that means the way of Kuru. And these, I guess it means Pasan means going the usual way, doesn't it? And those previously argumentative or bright became vague, dull, apathetic, and had no interest in starting off a conversation. And they had loss of episodic memory, but for recent events, basically. And then frontal lobe signs, grasping, groping, and pathological laughter or crying, usually laughter, hence the laughing death. So I think I probably should wrap this up now. I think, yeah. I'll just remind myself of what I'm missing out on. Not much stuff about prions. So it's a prion, which is basically an infectious protein particle, and that transmits this illness. The way it works is the prion, once it latches onto a normal prion, there's for some reason there's lots of prion floating around in the central nervous system, pardon me, and it's on the surface of cells. And somehow it can twist the conformation of that normal prion to the same as the infectious prion. The infectious prion isn't deliberately infectious in the way of a bacteria or a virus, it just happens to act as an infectious particle. It's actually just a protein going about its life, it's just unfortunately undergone sort of a flip, which has made it able to flip other prions. And so this chap, Krusner, realised that something like this must be happening, and he got the Nobel Prize for this, for his work in this area, which I haven't really looked into in detail, although I have read it years and years ago. And I didn't understand it then, and I'm not sure I would have now, but it does seem to underline Einstein's dictum: when you've eliminated all which is impossible, and whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. But he had difficulty persuading Gajacek of this. He never accepted the word prion and insisted it be taken out of the paper they were writing together. Well, actually, that Krusner was writing, and he was kindly putting Gajacek's name on somewhat reluctantly. So that's what happens. So this is the normal prion protein called prion protein cellular, stuck on the outside of the cell. But if it gets attacked by one of these abnormal prions, it flips it into this shape here, which can then become an extensive fibril, which then ends up getting deposited outside the cells, and somehow it's toxic and kills them. So that's the underlying mechanism of these transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. Spongiform because of this business, these little holes, which are actually in the neurons and the neuron processes. This is a plaque of prion material in the cerebellum. These are dying Purkinje cells with lumps on them, and these are plaques of prion protein similar to this, stained with an immunostain. So that's the whole story. Any questions or comments? Yeah.
Is Kuru completely eliminated?
Yeah, it is. Yeah,
No,
eating the flesh of someone affected, and there's no one left affected. So even if you were Hannibal Lecter, you'd have trouble.
Like have some remote tribe somewhere in the Andes or something like that.
Yeah, no. See, what they think happened in retrospect is that, I didn't go into all this because I ran this out of time, but with Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which can be hereditary, you inherit the abnormal protein. It still takes a long time for the disease to manifest, but once it does manifest, it usually kills you within a year, a bit like Kuru. So that's similar, but the disease mainly affects the cortex of the brain, not cerebellum. Although there is a cerebellar form of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, and then there is just spontaneous cases of unexplained spontaneous cases. There's actually an increased rate of spontaneous cases in pathologists, but it's still pretty rare because prions are very hard to destroy once if they dry onto a surface. You can only really burn them off with a gas torch, pretty much, or certain hydroxide works, but usually damages the stainless steel and stuff. So what they think happens there is that there's a spontaneous, 1 in a million per year flip of a molecule, and once that happens, it just goes off in a cascade, but then there's a long incubation period before the illness starts, and it's just the same way. So, and then it can be transferred iatrogenically with brain depth electrodes, surgical instruments, lots of graft, dural major graft. I think there's something else too. Human growth hormone used to be harvested from pituitaries, and that transmitted Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. So really this opened up, although it's narrow, it opened up and explained otherwise inexplicable illnesses. And there's a thought that some conditions, some Parkinsonian conditions, may have a prion-like action going on, but they're not infectious in the same way that Creutzfeldt-Jakob and Kuru and bovine spongiform encephalopathy are.
Why do you think it's only the women that were eating?
What was that, sorry?
Why do you think it's only the women and uninitiated boys that eat it?
Well, it was just a custom, Yeah, as far as I can make out. Yeah, no, I don't know.
Because usually men get the best of everything.
Well, they said that when the men did eat human flesh, it was muscle. I think it was partly they wanted to take on board the attributes of the person who died, and it was kind of a loving act, to perpetuate the person somehow. I think it's not completely clear to me, but and I didn't put as much energy into understanding that part as I could have done. Like Shirley would have done a lot of that. Sorry, Bob, were you going to ask a question? Yeah.
Well, I heard a lecture when I was in Port Moresby, I think it was by Gay disease, I might be wrong there, in which the cannibalism feasts was highlighted as the explanation for Kuru. Men were given first choice of what they ate of their bodies, and the pickings were left for the children and women. And this included the eating of the brain, I presume.
Yeah. Well, what I read didn't accentuate that part of it, and in fact, Gage said one of the things he never accepted really was that the cannibalism transmitted to Kuru. He thought it was, or he claimed he thought it was the contamination of the hands, infection of cuts, getting in their eyes and that sort of thing. He was very difficult about it. I think it was really just because it wasn't his idea. But like Stanley Prusner, the prion wasn't his idea, not made here, kind of thing.
So, David, has much been written about changing the social behaviours of the people to eradicate the disease, or?
Yeah, the anthropologists have been all over it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that would
Shirley,
be a follow-up.
Shirley Guess has written a book. Annette Beasley's written she's written another one about the wrangling that went on. There's the historian Frank Nelson who I only skimmed a bit because I didn't really have time to read it. That's pretty good. He's not an anthropologist though.
Right. Yeah.
There's another person. I can't think of it as well. Yeah. What was the other thing? That was something else. Sorry, had 2 things on the go. Yeah, I think whereas Gadgetsy had about 15 things on the go.
What's that?
Gadgetsy. I mean, while all this was going on, he was investigating things in other countries. You know, he wasn't just doing Kuru. No, yeah, I think he thought it was great. You know, I mean, people told him he was mad to go to New Guinea. You know, that he was giving up a job, he'd never get re-employed. You know, and Dick would, Bob would know something about this because you were around when this was going on, Bob. And but he did get taken back on, and you know, his kids were brought up in New Guinea for a large chunk of their childhoods, and I think they thought it was a marvellous experience. So I don't think Faye thought it was so great, you know, because every couple of years she'd get sort of wrenched out of all her friends and stuck in New Guinea, and then wrenched away from New Guinea and stuck back in New Zealand. So I think she had it pretty tough, you know. But I don't know if you know her, but she's a pretty buoyant character.
And I think we better have our final question.
I was just going to say, what happened to Gadgetsy in the end?
We went to jail for 4 years, went to Europe, and he died in the 2008, 2009, 2008 I think. It was a big fish for 50 years of Kuru, because this person, I think they thought they were down to the last case, and it was held in London. Gadgetsy was at the meeting, died later that year. He was about 85, I think, at the time.
David, thank you so much for all the preparation and the value that we've got from having this presentation, and that it has been recorded, and so I know that so many other people will be interested in it, and possibly your slides if you could have them, and it's a great tool for people that want to follow up on the story. And I can really identify with the hurt feelings over who was first author and the machinations of authorship.
So I'll tell you one other funny story. This only happened yesterday. This isn't doing it. No, it is. I read a paper. I got that picture of the prion protein and the beta sheet, which I didn't explain about, from a guy called Sleator, who's an Irish academic, and he wrote a paper on it. And in it, he said that only the hadioalpha cells are affected, and I thought this must be some weird word to imply cells with a healthy protein state or something, you know. So I decided to email him after. I looked it up on Google, and the only reference to the word was in his paper. Now, can anyone suggest what the actual problem was? It eluded me, but there was a simple explanation for this. It was a typo. But anyway, I emailed him last night, and he emailed back to me this morning saying he was embarrassed to report it was a typo. I sent him a reply to that, but I haven't heard back in time to report any update.
Thank you very, very much.
So stuff is fantastic. You know, I could find all this stuff and talk to you.
Thank you so much, and everyone, please feel